The camera mounted in the shelter's corner had been recording for 47 hours when it captured the moment that would later be analyzed by military intelligence, replayed on news broadcasts across 3 continents, and studied in canine training academies as an example of canine behavioral patterns under extreme stress. But in that moment, 3:47 a.m. on a February night when the temperature inside the basement shelter hovered just above freezing, the camera was simply documenting what it had been installed to document: the faces of people waiting for the world to stop ending. 83 civilians huddled in the converted bomb shelter beneath Kharkiv's 2nd District Community Center, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the dim emergency lighting. Most were elderly, too frail to evacuate, too stubborn to leave, too tired to keep running. A handful were families with young children, parents who'd missed the last evacuation convoy or chosen to stay for reasons that made sense at the time but felt increasingly foolish with each passing hour. And in the corner farthest from the shelter's reinforced door, a little girl named Sofia Marchenko sat with her arms wrapped around a dog that shouldn't have been there at all. The dog, a Belgian Malinois mix, dark sable coat matted with dirt and something that might have been blood, amber eyes that tracked every movement in the shelter with unsettling intensity, had appeared 3 days earlier, squeezing through a gap in the shelter's ventilation system that no one had realized was large enough to admit anything bigger than a rat. He wore no collar, no tags, no identification. But his behavior suggested military training, the way he moved with deliberate precision, the way his ears swiveled to track sounds beyond human hearing range, the way he positioned himself with clear sight lines to both the entrance and the ventilation shaft, as if calculating escape routes or defensive positions. Sofia's mother, Oksana, had tried to shoo the dog away that first day. "We barely have food for ourselves. We can't feed a stray." But Sofia, 6 years old, dark-haired, carrying a stuffed rabbit that had once been pink but was now grey with dirt, had looked at the dog with an expression that held no room for negotiation. "He needs us, Mama. Look at his eyes, he's scared too." The dog hadn't looked scared. He'd looked alert, focused, almost unnaturally aware. But Oksana was too exhausted to argue with her daughter, too worn down by 3 weeks of living in a basement, too depleted by the constant calculations of rationing food and water and hope to fight over a stray dog that would probably leave on its own anyway. The dog didn't leave, and now 3 days later he sat pressed against Sofia's side, his body heat radiating through her thin jacket, his breathing synchronized with hers in a way that felt almost deliberate. But something was wrong. Oksana could feel it, a pressure in the air that had nothing to do with the shelter's poor ventilation or the weight of concrete and earth pressing down from above. It was the kind of wrongness that lived at the edge of perception, the sensation of being watched or followed, or standing at the threshold of something terrible. She looked at the dog and found him staring back at her with those amber eyes that seemed to carry too much intelligence, too much understanding. And in that moment, the emergency lighting flickered once, twice, then went dark. The hours before, 48 hours earlier, the shelter had still felt manageable. Crowded, yes. Uncomfortable, certainly, but survivable. The emergency generators provided power for lighting and the ventilation system. Food supplies, though meager, remained adequate if rationed carefully. Water came from a deep well with a manual pump, untouched by surface contamination. The shelter coordinator, a retired civil engineer named Petro Kovalchuk, maintained order through a combination of practical organization and grim humor. He'd assigned sleeping rotations, established bathroom schedules, mediated disputes over space allocation with the patience of someone who understood that people under stress needed structure more than sympathy. Oksana had been grateful for that structure. It gave her something to focus on besides the questions that circled her mind like vultures. Where was her husband, who'd stayed behind to help with evacuations? When would the shelling stop? Would they run out of food before they ran out of time? Sofia, mercifully, seemed almost unaffected. Children possessed a terrible adaptability, a capacity to normalize horror that Oksana found both comforting and heartbreaking. Her daughter had made friends with the other children in the shelter, had turned the space between supply crates into an imaginary playhouse, had somehow maintained the ability to laugh even when the ground shook from nearby artillery impacts. And then the dog had arrived and something in Sofia had shifted. She became quieter, more watchful. She stopped playing with the other children and instead sat in the corner with the animal, whispering to it in a voice too low for Oksana to hear, her small hands buried in its fur. "It's not healthy," said Mrs. Bondarenko, an older woman who'd appointed herself the shelter's unofficial advisor on child rearing, despite never having raised children herself. "The girl is becoming too attached. When we evacuate, she'll have to leave the dog behind. Better to create distance now." But Oksana had watched the way Sofia's breathing calmed when she touched the dog, the way the animal's presence seemed to anchor her daughter in a reality that was spinning increasingly out of control. And she'd decided that whatever comfort the dog provided was worth the eventual pain of separation. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that separation was the last thing she needed to worry about. The first strange detail appeared on the second day of the dog's residence. Petro had been conducting his morning inventory check, counting supplies, calculating consumption rates, doing the mathematics of survival. He'd noticed something odd: the dog's food consumption. They'd been feeding the animal scraps, bits of bread, vegetable peelings, the remnants of meals that humans couldn't stomach. Not much, barely enough to sustain a creature of that size. Yet the dog showed no signs of malnutrition or weakness. If anything, it seemed stronger, more alert than when it had arrived. "Maybe it's hunting rats," suggested one of the shelter residents. "There are no rats," Petro had replied. "I've been checking for infestation. This shelter is sealed tight. Nothing gets in or out except through the main door or the ventilation system. Then maybe the dog isn't eating. Maybe it's just existing." The statement had been meant as a joke, but it landed with uncomfortable weight, because the dog did seem to exist in a state that defied normal animal behavior. Never sleeping deeply, never relaxing completely, always maintaining that alert, focused awareness that suggested purpose beyond mere survival. Petro had made a note in his log: "Dog's behavior anomalous. Recommend observation." Then he'd moved on to more pressing concerns, like the fact that the ventilation system was making a grinding noise that suggested mechanical failure, and the generator fuel would last perhaps another 5 days if they were careful. He should have paid more attention to the dog. The shift. The change began so subtly that no one noticed at first. The dog's behavior shifted from alert to agitated, from watchful to desperate. It started pacing, slow circuits of the shelter's perimeter, nose low to the ground, occasionally stopping to sniff at the ventilation grates or paw at the concrete floor. Sofia noticed first. "Mama, something's wrong with him. He's scared. He's probably just restless. Dogs need exercise. He's been cooped up too long." But even as Oksana said it, she knew it was wrong. The dog wasn't acting restless. It was acting purposeful, like it was searching for something or tracking something invisible to human senses. The pacing intensified. The dog moved faster, its circuits becoming tighter, more frantic. It would stop at specific spots, always the same spots, Oksana noted, and dig at the concrete with its claws, scraping until the sound made people wince and complain. "Control your animal," someone shouted from across the shelter. "It's not my—" Oksana stopped. When had she started thinking of the dog as theirs? When had the stray become my animal? Sofia wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, trying to calm it. "Shh, it's okay. We're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt us." But the dog pulled away from her embrace, the first time it had ever rejected her touch, and moved to the shelter's reinforced door. It stood there rigid, every muscle tense, a low sound building in its chest. Not a growl exactly, something deeper, more primal, the sound of an animal that had detected a threat. Petro approached, his engineer's mind already working through possibilities. What's it sensing? Gas leak? Structural compromise? The ventilation system's been making noise. Maybe it's detecting carbon monoxide buildup. He pulled out a portable detector. One of the shelter's emergency supplies, checked the readings, all normal. Air quality within acceptable parameters. No toxic gases. No immediate danger. But the dog's behavior intensified. It began to bark, sharp, urgent barks that echoed off the concrete walls and made children cry and adults press their hands over their ears. "Get that animal under control or I'm putting it outside," someone yelled. Sofia ran to the dog, wrapped her arms around it again, pressed her face against its neck. "Please stop, please, they'll make you leave and I need you to stay." And incredibly, the dog stopped barking, went silent, but its body remained rigid, trembling with tension, and its eyes never left the reinforced door, as if it knew something terrible was about to come through. Oksana felt ice slide down her spine. She looked at the door, solid steel, reinforced with additional plating, designed to withstand direct artillery strikes. Nothing could get through that door without explosive charges or heavy equipment, but the dog stared at it like it was made of paper. Like whatever was coming wouldn't need explosives to get inside. The emergency lighting flickered. Once, twice, went dark. And in the sudden absolute darkness, Oksana heard her daughter scream. Into the dark. The scream died in Sofia's throat as quickly as it had emerged, not because the fear passed, but because her mother's hand clamped over her mouth, muffling the sound before it could spread panic through the shelter like wildfire. Shh, Malia, shh. It's just the lights. The generator failed, that's all. But it wasn't all. Because in the absolute darkness that followed the power failure, Sofia could feel the dog's body go rigid against hers, could hear the low rumble building in its chest again, could sense, through some mechanism that had nothing to do with sight, that the animal was tracking something moving through the darkness. Voices erupted around them. Panicked questions, children crying, someone demanding that Petro fix the generator immediately, as if darkness were a problem that could be solved through shouting. Flashlights clicked on, their beams cutting through the blackness in narrow cones that revealed more shadow than substance. Everyone remained calm. Petro's voice carried the forced authority of someone trying to convince himself as much as others. The backup batteries will engage in 30 seconds. This is a standard power transition protocol. But 30 seconds passed, then 60. The backup batteries didn't engage. The emergency lighting remained dark. And in that prolonged darkness, Sofia felt the dog pull away from her grasp, felt him move with purpose toward something she couldn't see. "Mama, he's leaving. He's going toward—" "Sofia, stay close to me. Don't follow the dog." But Sofia was already moving, her small hand trailing along the dog's back, using his body as a guide through the darkness. Oksana had no choice but to follow, one hand on her daughter's shoulder, the other extended in front of her to avoid collision with the 82 other people, now moving in various directions with increasing desperation. The dog led them away from the main shelter area, toward the back section where supplies were stored. Crates of water bottles, boxes of non-perishable food, medical supplies organized on metal shelving that Petro had installed with meticulous precision. A space most residents avoided, because it was farthest from the ventilation system, where the air grew stale and the walls wept condensation that smelled of rust and old earth. The dog stopped. Sofia bumped into him in the darkness, felt his muscles coiled tight, felt vibrations running through his body that might have been trembling or might have been something else, like a machine preparing to activate. "What is it?" Oksana whispered. "What does he—" She stopped because she heard it too, a sound that didn't belong. Mechanical, rhythmic, coming from the wall where it shouldn't come from anything, because that wall was solid concrete, 3 feet thick, designed to withstand direct artillery impact. The sound of drilling, slow, methodical, patient. Someone was cutting through the wall. The realization. Oksana's mind went through possibilities with the desperate speed of someone searching for explanations that didn't end in terror. Rescue team. It had to be a rescue team. Ukrainian forces had finally secured the sector, were extracting civilians from shelters, were cutting through the wall because the door was blocked or damaged or... But rescue teams announced themselves, used loudspeakers, called out in Ukrainian to let people know help was coming. They didn't drill through walls in silence while the power was mysteriously cut, didn't approach through the one section of the shelter that was farthest from the door and most difficult to defend. "Petro!" she called out, her voice sharp with urgency. "Petro, someone's cutting through the back wall." The shelter coordinator appeared moments later, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, his face drawn with exhaustion and something else. Fear, perhaps, or the recognition that the scenario he'd spent weeks preparing for had finally arrived. He placed his hand against the wall where the sound originated, felt vibrations running through the concrete, pulled his hand back as if the surface had burned him. "That's a diamond-tipped drill," he said quietly. "Military grade. Takes about 40 minutes to cut through concrete this thickness." He looked at his watch, then at Oksana. "How long have you been hearing it?" "Just now, maybe 2 minutes." "Then they started 38 minutes ago, probably right when the power went out." He turned, called out to the darkness behind him. "Everyone move to the front section. Now this is not a drill." The shelter erupted into motion. People scrambled in darkness broken only by inadequate flashlight beams, grabbing children and belongings, moving toward the reinforced door with the chaotic momentum of a crowd that understands danger without fully comprehending its shape. But Oksana stood frozen, her daughter pressed against her legs, the dog rigid and trembling between them. Because if hostile forces were cutting through the wall, moving to the front of the shelter didn't mean safety. It meant being trapped between 2 points of entry, the door they couldn't open quickly and the wall that was about to be breached. "Mama, we need to hide." Sophia's voice was small but certain, carrying the kind of clarity children sometimes accessed in crisis. "The dog knows where. He'll show us. Sophia, we need to stay with the group. We need to—" The drilling sound changed pitch, became higher, sharper. The sound of a tool breaking through from one side to the other. They were through. The dog didn't wait. It moved, not toward the front section where everyone else was fleeing, but perpendicular, toward a corner of the storage area that Oksana had never paid attention to because it held nothing but empty crates and a ventilation grate covered in dust and rust. The dog began to dig at the grate, claws scraping metal with a sound that made Oksana's teeth ache. But the grate didn't budge. It was sealed, secured, designed to prevent exactly this kind of unauthorized entry or exit. Then the dog did something extraordinary. It grabbed the grate's edge with its teeth and pulled, using its entire body weight as leverage, muscles straining with effort that should have been impossible for an animal that hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The grate tore free, not elegantly. It came away in a screech of tortured metal and scattered bolts, revealing a ventilation shaft just barely large enough for a child to squeeze through, maybe an adult if they were small and willing to contort themselves into painful positions. "No." Oksana's voice was flat. "Absolutely not. We don't know where that shaft leads. It could be sealed. It could open onto the street where—" The drilling stopped. Complete silence followed, more frightening than the sound had been because silence meant completion, meant whoever was on the other side of that wall was now preparing to enter. Their voice came through the opening speaking Russian, not Ukrainian, Russian. The accent was unmistakable, the words chillingly clear in the shelter's acoustics. "Seal the front entrance, no one leaves, we process them here." Process. The word landed like a stone in Oksana's stomach, because she knew what it meant, had heard the stories from other shelters that had been liberated by Russian forces. Processing meant interrogation, meant identifying military-age males, separating families, documenting everyone for later filtration camps where people disappeared into bureaucratic nightmares or simply vanished. The dog was already in the ventilation shaft, its body disappearing into darkness, with the fluid efficiency of a creature that had done this before. It paused, looked back at Sophia, amber eyes catching the dim flashlight beam. Oksana made the decision she never wanted to make. "Go, follow the dog, I'll be right behind you." The escaped Sophia didn't argue. She squeezed into the shaft, her small body fitting easily into space that looked impossibly narrow. Oksana followed, feeling metal scrape against her shoulders, her hips, every movement an exercise in controlled claustrophobia. Behind them, chaos erupted in the main shelter area, shouting, screaming, the sound of the reinforced door being forced open from outside, flashlights everywhere, voices demanding cooperation in Russian-accented Ukrainian, the mechanical clicking of weapons being readied. Oksana pulled herself forward with her elbows, pushing with her feet, following the sound of Sophia's breathing and the dog's movement ahead. The shaft was pitch black, the metal beneath her cold enough to burn through clothing, the air thick with decades of accumulated dust that made every breath a struggle. They crawled for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. The shaft branched, split, became a maze of ventilation infrastructure that should have been impossible to navigate in darkness. But the dog knew the way. Turned left, then right, then left again, with the confidence of something following a map only it could read. Sophia whispered from somewhere ahead, "Mama, I'm scared." "I know, Malyesh, keep following the dog, he knows where he's going." But Oksana didn't know that. Didn't know anything except that staying in the shelter meant being processed, documented, separated from her daughter. And whatever waited at the end of this ventilation shaft, even if it was a dead end, even if it was a 3-story drop onto concrete, it couldn't be worse than that. The shaft began to slope upward. Oksana's arms burned with effort, her breathing coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, distantly, she could hear voices echoing through the ventilation system, commands in Russian. Someone had discovered the torn grate, had realized people had escaped through the shaft, had sent soldiers to pursue. "Faster!" Oksana hissed, "Sophia, move faster!" The shaft leveled out. A head, barely visible, a grey rectangle that might have been light filtering in from outside. The dog squeezed through it, disappeared. Sophia followed. And then Oksana was pulling herself through a gap barely wider than her shoulders, feeling metal tear at her jacket, scrape skin from her arms, emerging into cold, fresh air, darkness that wasn't absolute. They were outside behind the community centre, in an alley filled with rubble and the skeletons of burned vehicles. Above them, the sky held the orange glow of fires burning across the city. Sophia clung to her mother, shaking. The dog stood beside them, head lowered, panting, looking back toward the ventilation opening they'd just emerged from as if expecting pursuit. And then Oksana saw it, hanging from the dog's collar, barely visible in the dim light. Something she'd never noticed before because the shelter had been too dark and she'd been too focused on survival to pay attention to details. Tag, metal, military issue. And on it, engraved with the precision of official documentation, K9 Unit, UKR P559 Handler, SGT. Fems Kovalenko specialty, search and rescue infiltration. The dog wasn't a stray, he was a military service animal, trained for exactly this scenario. Entering hostile territory, finding civilians, leading them out through routes enemy forces wouldn't expect. But where was his handler? Why was the dog operating alone? And how had he known to enter that specific shelter at that specific time, as if he'd been watching, waiting, preparing for the moment when extraction would be necessary? Oksana's mind reeled with questions she couldn't answer. But the immediate question, the only one that mattered, was simple. Where were they supposed to go now? The dog answered by moving. Not randomly, not with the aimless wandering of an animal in unfamiliar territory, but with purpose, following a route that suggested training, mission parameters, a destination programmed into instincts refined through countless operations. Sophia took her mother's hand. "We follow him, right?" Oksana looked back at the community centre, at the ventilation opening they'd emerged from, at the building that had been their refuge for 3 weeks and was now a trap they'd barely escaped. She looked at the dog, at the military tag on its collar, at amber eyes that held intelligence and purpose and something that felt almost like promise. "Yes," she said finally, "we follow him." They moved into the darkness, 3 figures navigating the ruins of a city at war, following a dog that somehow knew the way to safety, even when humans had lost all sense of direction. But behind them, in the shelter they'd escaped, something else was happening. Something they couldn't see but would later learn about through news reports and survivor testimonies and military intelligence briefings. The Russian soldiers who'd breached the shelter were finding something unexpected. Not just civilians hiding in a basement, but evidence of something larger. Coordinates written on walls, radio equipment hidden behind false panels, documents suggesting the shelter had been used for more than just refuge. Someone in that shelter had been working with Russian forces, providing intelligence, marking locations for artillery strikes, acting as a forward observer for an enemy that rewarded cooperation with temporary safety and punished resistance with annihilation. And the dog, the K9 unit that had entered the shelter 3 days earlier, had been there to find them, to identify them, to mark the location for extraction, not civilian extraction, intelligence extraction. But something had gone wrong. The operation had been compromised, and now the dog was doing what it had been trained to do when mission parameters failed: protect the innocent. Extract civilians. Complete the mission even when completion meant abandoning original objectives in favor of saving lives. Oksana didn't know any of this yet, wouldn't know for weeks. But as they followed the dog through smoke-filled streets, as Sophia stumbled over rubble and clung to the animal's fur for balance, as the sounds of the compromised shelter faded behind them, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, something almost forgotten. The handler's search sergeant Mykola Kovalenko had been searching for his dog for 72 hours when the security camera footage crossed his desk. He'd been manning a temporary command post in what remained of a police station 3 kilometers from the compromised shelter, coordinating intelligence operations with the skeletal resources of a police force stretched impossibly thin across a city falling sector by sector. Sleep had become theoretical, something other people did, something he'd get around to when the war ended or he died, whichever came first. The footage arrived via encrypted military channel, forwarded by a signals intelligence officer who'd been monitoring Russian communications and noticed something anomalous, an unauthorized K9 unit operating in enemy-controlled territory without handler oversight. Mykola had watched the grainy video 3 times before he was certain. The dog entering the shelter's ventilation system. The subtle way it moved, not like a stray seeking refuge, but like an operator executing infiltration protocols. The military tag visible for exactly 2 frames when the animal turned its head at a specific angle. His dog. Unit designation UKRP 559. Call sign. Veles, after the Slavic god of earth and the underworld. He's operational, Mykola had whispered to the empty room, feeling something break loose in his chest. Relief mixed with terror, mixed with the terrible pride that comes from watching something you trained exceed your expectations in the worst possible circumstances. Because if Veles was operating independently, it meant the mission had been compromised. Meant the handler extraction that was supposed to pull Mykola out 72 hours ago had failed. Meant his K9 partner had made the decision, somehow impossibly, to continue the operation alone. But what operation? The shelter had been marked for intelligence observation, not civilian extraction. They'd identified it as a potential forward observation post for Russian forces. Suspected someone inside was feeding targeting coordinates to enemy artillery. Veles had been deployed to enter covertly, mark the location with traceable scent markers, allow signals intelligence to triangulate communication patterns. A surveillance op clean, simple, no civilian involvement. So why was the dog now leading civilians through ventilation shafts? Why had he deviated from mission parameters? And more importantly, what had he found inside that shelter that changed everything? Mykola pulled up satellite imagery of the community center, overlaid Russian force movements from the last 72 hours, cross-referenced with artillery strike patterns and civilian casualty reports, and saw the pattern. The shelter had been breached not to extract intelligence assets, but to eliminate witnesses. Someone inside had been compromised, likely captured, interrogated, forced to reveal the extent of their cooperation with Russian forces. And now the enemy was cleaning house, removing everyone who might testify about the collaboration, including civilians who'd been sheltering alongside the informant without knowing what was happening around them. Mykola felt cold settle into his bones. If Veles hadn't extracted those civilians, if that woman and her daughter had remained in the shelter when Russian forces processed everyone inside, they'd be dead now. Or worse, detained, questioned, disappeared into filtration systems designed to erase inconvenient truths. His dog had gone off mission to save lives, had prioritized humanitarian extraction over intelligence objectives, had made a choice that no training manual covered, because training manuals assumed handlers would be present to make such choices. "Where are you now, boy?" Mykola asked the frozen security footage, as if the image could answer. "Where did you take them?" The route Veles led Oksana and Sofia through a city transformed by war into something alien and hostile. Streets they'd walked for years became unrecognizable, familiar landmarks destroyed, navigation reduced to avoiding burning buildings and the intermittent crack of sniper fire from positions impossible to pinpoint. The dog moved with absolute confidence, following a route that seemed random but wasn't. Oksana realized after the 4th turn that Veles was avoiding main streets, staying parallel to major thoroughfares, using alleyways and courtyards and the skeletal remains of bombed buildings as cover. Military training, movement discipline, the patterns of someone who understood urban warfare at an instinctive level. Sofia stumbled over rubble, caught herself, kept moving. She'd stopped asking where they were going, stopped questioning whether they should trust the dog. At 6 years old, she'd learned something most adults took lifetimes to understand, that certainty was a luxury, that sometimes you followed because following was better than standing still. They'd been walking for 20 minutes when they heard the sound. Helicopter. Low. Close. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades cutting through smoke-thick air. Veles froze, looked up, then bolted toward a partially collapsed garage, squeezing through a gap in the rubble. Oksana and Sofia followed, pressing themselves against concrete still warm from recent fires. The helicopter passed overhead, Russian military, the markings visible even through smoke. Searchlights sweeping the streets below in methodical patterns, looking for something or someone, looking for them. How do they know? Oksana whispered, more to herself than to Sophia. How do they know we got out? But she already knew the answer. The soldiers who'd breached the shelter had found the torn ventilation grate, had realized people escaped, had radioed for aerial pursuit because 3 people on foot couldn't move faster than helicopters could search. Unless those 3 people were being guided by something that understood evasion tactics better than any human. Veles waited until the helicopter moved 2 blocks south, then emerged from cover and continued moving. Not running. Running drew attention, created movement that spotters trained to detect. Instead, he maintained a steady pace that looked purposeful, but not panicked, following shadows and staying close to walls. They walked for another 15 minutes. The sounds of the city changed. Fewer explosions, less gunfire. The architecture shifted too, became older, more residential. And then Oksana recognized where they were. The old industrial district, abandoned since the 1990s when the Soviet factories closed, left to decay into rust and graffiti, and the kind of urban wilderness that cities created and then forgot. Perfect for hiding. Perfect for operations that needed to stay invisible. Veles led them to a warehouse that looked no different from dozens of others. Corrugated metal walls, broken windows, doors hanging from twisted hinges. But when they entered, Oksana saw signs of recent occupation. Sleeping bags arranged in a corner, military ration wrappers, a battery-powered radio, a safe house, operating base, somewhere Ukrainian forces maintained for exactly this scenario, civilians needing extraction from enemy-controlled sectors. "Hello?" Oksana called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. "Is anyone here?" No response. The safe house was empty. Had been abandoned, perhaps, or was simply unstaffed because resources were stretched too thin to maintain proper operational security. But there were supplies, water bottles, food, blankets, and most importantly, a military-grade radio with instructions taped to its side in Ukrainian. Oksana read the instructions twice, making sure she understood. Then she picked up the radio, tuned it to the frequency indicated, and pressed the transmit button. "This is a civilian emergency broadcast. I'm Oksana Marchenko, Ukrainian national, currently located in a safe house in the industrial district with my 6-year-old daughter. We escaped from the community center shelter during Russian breach. We were led here by a military K9 unit. Designation," she paused, reading the tag on Veles's collar. "UKRP 559, requesting immediate extraction, over." Static. Then a voice, male, exhausted but alert. "Copy that, civilian broadcast. Confirm you said K9 unit UKRP 559. Confirmed. The dog led us out through ventilation systems, guided us through the city to this location." A longer pause, then, "Stand by, connecting you to K9 handler oversight." More static. Then a different voice, younger, raw with emotion barely controlled. "This is Sergeant Kovalenko, handler for UKRP 559. Confirm current status of the dog." Oksana looked at Veles, who sat calmly beside Sophia, the girl's arms wrapped around his neck. He's fine, tired, but fine. He saved our lives." She heard something on the other end that might have been a sob, or might have been laughter, or might have been both. "That's my boy, that's my good boy." A breath, composure regained. "Ma'am, I need you to do exactly what I say. There's a tracking beacon in the safe house, hidden in the radio casing. Activate it by pressing the red button on the device's underside. That'll give us your exact coordinates. Extraction team will reach you in approximately 30 minutes. Until then, stay inside, stay quiet, and trust the dog. If he alerts to danger, you move, understood?" "Understood. And ma'am, tell Vela—" The voice broke slightly. "Tell him his handler is coming. Tell him he did good." While they waited for extraction, Sophia explored the safe house with the fearless curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned that exploration could be dangerous. She found more military supplies, first aid kits, ammunition boxes, tactical vests, and in the corner, hidden beneath a tarp, something that made her gasp. "Mama, look!" Oksana crossed to where her daughter stood, pulling back the tarp to reveal what Sophia had found, a stuffed rabbit. Pink, missing one ear. Identical to the one Sophia carried, the one that was now grey with dirt and torn from weeks in the shelter. But this one was new, clean, as if it had been placed here recently, deliberately, waiting for someone who needed it. Oksana felt something cold slide through her chest. She picked up the rabbit, turned it over, and found what she'd been dreading, a tag sewn into the fabric. Not a manufacturer's tag, a military identification tag, the kind used to mark equipment and supplies, and on it, handwritten in Ukrainian, "For the innocent." For those who survive. She understood then, with terrible clarity, what the safe house really was. Not just a waypoint for soldiers or a cache for supplies. It was a memorial, a reminder. A place where people left tokens for the civilians they couldn't save, toys for children who died, photos of families that no longer existed, small objects that represented everything lost to war. The rabbit wasn't meant for Sophia specifically. It was meant for whoever needed it next. For whatever child survived long enough to make it here and find something that said, "You matter. Your survival matters." Someone thought about you even when they couldn't save everyone. Oksana pressed the stuffed rabbit into Sophia's hands, watched her daughter's face light up with simple joy that felt obscene in its innocence. "Keep it, Malish. Someone left it for you." Why? Because people are good. Even when everything else is terrible, people are still good. It was a lie, of course. Or perhaps not a lie, but an oversimplification, because the same shelter that had housed them for 3 weeks had also housed an informant marking civilians for death. The same city that contained safe houses like this also contained collaborators who traded intelligence for survival. War didn't sort people into clear categories of good and evil. It created situations where ordinary people made impossible choices and lived or died based on factors too chaotic to predict. But Sophia didn't need to know that yet. She needed to believe the world still contained goodness, that help existed even in darkness, that someone had thought to leave a rabbit for a girl they'd never meet. Veles approached, sniffed the new rabbit, then returned to his position by the door. Alert, watching, waiting for extraction or danger, whichever arrived first. Oksana sat beside her daughter, one arm around Sophia's shoulders, the other resting on Veles's back. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to think about the future. Not the immediate future of survival and extraction, but the distant future where this would be memory instead of present reality. Would Sophia remember this? Would she carry trauma that surfaced in nightmares and triggers, or would she process it with the resilience that allowed children to survive things that broke adults? Would Oksana herself ever feel safe again? Or would the rest of her life be defined by the constant scanning for threats, the inability to trust shelter, the knowledge that walls could be breached and basements could become traps? And what about Veles? What happened to war dogs when wars ended? Did they retire to peaceful lives, or did the violence embed itself so deeply that they could never truly leave the battlefield behind? She didn't have answers, but she had this moment, her daughter alive, a dog watching over them, extraction coming. And for now, in this war where moments were all anyone could count on, it was enough. Outside, the sound of helicopters returned. Closer this time. Multiple aircraft moving in coordinated patterns that suggested military operation rather than simple patrol. Veles's ears swiveled. A low sound built in his chest. Not a growl, but something deeper, more complex. Recognition mixed with anticipation. The extraction team had arrived. But so had something else. The collapse. The sound differentiation happened in Veles's brain faster than conscious thought. Ukrainian helicopters moved with specific rotor rhythms, maintained different altitudes, approached in formation patterns drilled through years of NATO standard training. The aircraft circling now carried those signatures: friendly forces, extraction team. But beneath that sound, woven through it like poison through water, came something else. Ground vehicles, multiple, moving fast. Not Ukrainian military. Those would coordinate with aerial extraction, would announce approach through encrypted channels. Russian forces, pursuing, tracking the same beacon signal that had called the extraction team. Veles moved before Oksana understood why, his body slamming into Sophia with enough force to knock her sideways, away from the warehouse's main entrance. The child yelped in surprise, the new pink rabbit tumbling from her hands. "What?" Oksana started. The warehouse's front wall exploded inward, not from artillery, from a vehicle. An armored personnel carrier that had simply driven through the corrugated metal as if it were paper, its bulk filling the entrance, blocking escape, armed soldiers spilling from its rear compartment with the practiced efficiency of units that had executed this maneuver hundreds of times. Russian uniforms, Russian weapons, Russian voices shouting commands in a language Oksana understood but wished she didn't. On the ground, hands visible now. Time fragmented into disconnected images, Sophia screaming. Veles positioning himself between the child and the soldiers, lips pulled back, every tooth visible. The lead soldier raising his weapon, finger moving toward trigger. And then, impossibly like divine intervention or tactical precision or both, the warehouse's roof tore apart. Not explosion, extraction. A Ukrainian military helicopter in hover position directly above them, side door open, rappel lines deployed, figures in tactical gear descending with the speed and purpose of angels dressed in Kevlar and determination. The Russians pivoted, caught between targets above and targets below, training warring with survival instinct. The helicopter's door gunner opened fire, not at the soldiers directly, but at the armored vehicle, forcing it to reverse, to withdraw, creating space. "Marchenko family," a voice from above amplified through helmet speakers, barely audible over rotor wash. "Grab the dog. We're extracting now." Oksana didn't think. Thought was luxury. She grabbed Sofia, wrapped one arm around her daughter's waist, reached for Veles with the other. The dog didn't resist, went limp in her grip with the trust of a creature that understood this chaos was somehow rescue. A figure descended the rappel line, not all the way to the ground, but close enough. Extended both hands. "Pass me the child." Oksana lifted Sofia, felt hands, strong, gloved, competent, take her daughter's weight. Watched her 6-year-old ascend into the helicopter's belly, disappearing into darkness and safety. The dog! She lifted Veles next, 40 kilograms of muscle and bone and purpose, made heavier by exhaustion and the dead weight of an animal trusting completely. The figure above grabbed the dog's tactical vest, hauled him up with strength that seemed superhuman, but was just training and adrenaline. "Now you grab the harness." Oksana reached up, felt metal clip onto her jacket, felt herself lifted with a violence that drove air from her lungs. The ground fell away beneath her feet. For 3 seconds she dangled, suspended between earth and sky, watching Russian soldiers pour back into the warehouse below. Then she was inside the helicopter, hands pulling her to safety. Door gunner still firing controlled bursts at the ground below, pilot banking hard, gaining altitude, moving toward Ukrainian-controlled territory at speeds that made her stomach rebel. Sofia was crying, Veles was panting, and Oksana was alive against all probability because a dog had led them to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The handler's reunion sergeant Mykola Kovalenko was waiting when the helicopter touched down at the forward operating base, 30 kilometers from Kharkiv's contested sectors. He'd been standing on the landing pad for 20 minutes, ignoring the cold, ignoring the protests from command that he should wait inside, ignoring everything except the horizon where his partner would appear. When the helicopter's door opened and Veles emerged, exhausted, filthy but alive and functional, Mykola felt something break inside his chest. He dropped to his knees as the dog ran to him, felt 72 hours of fear and pride and terrible love crash over him like a wave. "Good boy," he whispered into Veles's fur, his voice breaking. "Good boy, you did so good." The dog whined, pressed against him, tail wagging with an enthusiasm that seemed impossible given the ordeal he'd just survived. But K9 units were built different, bred for resilience, trained for stress tolerance, capable of compartmentalizing trauma in ways humans struggled to match. Oksana approached slowly, Sofia clinging to her side, both of them wrapped in emergency blankets that did nothing to hide their exhaustion and shock. She looked at Mykola, at the sergeant's patches on his uniform, at the tears running openly down his face. "Is he yours?" she asked. "He's his own," Mykola replied, standing, one hand still buried in Veles's fur. "I just have the honor of working with him. He saved our lives multiple times in ways I still don't understand." Mykola nodded, accepting this as fact rather than praise. He was deployed on intelligence operation, surveillance, not extraction. But when the situation changed, when civilian lives were at stake, he adapted, made choices his training prepared him for, but that no mission briefing could have anticipated. He looked down at Veles. "That's the difference between a tool and a partner. Tools follow programming, partners make decisions." "What happened in that shelter?" Oksana asked. "Who was the informant? Who were they marking for Russian artillery?" Mykola's expression hardened. "We're still piecing it together, but initial interrogations suggest the informant was Petro Kovalchuk, the shelter coordinator." Oksana felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. Petro, the engineer who'd maintained order, who'd organized rotations, who'd seemed so competent and trustworthy. The man who'd known everyone's location at all times. who'd controlled access to supplies, who'd been in position to observe patterns and report them to anyone who asked. He was feeding coordinates to Russian forces, Mykola continued, marking civilian shelters, providing targeting data for artillery strikes. In exchange for... He stopped, shook his head. It doesn't matter. There's no exchange rate that justifies what he did. Is he alive? He's in custody. Military tribunal will handle his case. Mykola's voice carried finality. But the people he marked, the families he traded for his own survival, most of them are dead. The shelter breach was designed to eliminate witnesses, to erase evidence of collaboration. You and your daughter survived because Veles got you out before the purge. Sofia had been quiet through the exchange, but now she spoke, her small voice carrying weight that belied her age. The dog knew. He knew something was wrong from the beginning. Dogs often do, Mykola said gently. They sense things we miss, behavioral cues, scent markers, patterns that register subconsciously. Veles detected the wrongness even if he couldn't articulate it. So he acted on instinct and training, prioritizing the most vulnerable targets for extraction. He looked at Oksana. You're not the only family he saved tonight. Signals intelligence tracked his movements over the last 72 hours. He made 3 separate extractions before reaching you. Other civilians trapped in similar situations, other children who needed rescue, each time adapting, each time succeeding, each time completing a mission no one explicitly gave him. The medal and the memory 3 weeks later, in a ceremony held at a reclaimed police station in liberated Kharkiv territory, they pinned a medal on Veles's tactical vest. The Medal of Military Merit, rarely awarded to animals but impossible to deny given documented evidence of multiple civilian extractions under enemy fire. Journalists were present, cameras recording, officials making speeches about courage and loyalty and the unbreakable bond between humans and the creatures that chose to protect them. But Oksana wasn't listening to the speeches. She was watching Sofia, who sat on the ground beside Veles, both arms wrapped around the dog's neck, face pressed against his fur in the same embrace that had been captured by that shelter camera weeks earlier. The embrace that had started as comfort and become something more, became symbol, became proof, became the moment that defined everything that followed. The camera footage had gone viral, not in the social media sense, but in the military intelligence sense. Analysts had studied it frame by frame, had used it to establish timeline for the shelter breach, had identified behavioral patterns in Veles's movement that were now being incorporated into updated K9 training protocols. But what the analysts couldn't quantify, what no amount of frame-by-frame analysis could capture, was the emotional truth at the footage's heart. A little girl hugging a dog in a shelter, seeking comfort in a creature that represented safety when safety seemed impossible. And that dog choosing to provide not just comfort, but salvation, leading her through darkness toward light, even when the path seemed impassable. After the ceremony, after the speeches and the photographs and the careful congratulations from officials who understood the political value of feel-good stories in a war defined by tragedy, Oksana pulled Mykola aside. What happens to him now? She asked, nodding toward Veles. He returns to service. He's still operational, still needed. The war isn't over. But he's exhausted. He's done enough. Can't he rest? Mykola's smile was sad. K9 units don't retire during active conflict. They work until the mission's complete, or they can't work anymore. That's what they're built for. That's what they choose. Choose? He's a dog. He doesn't choose, doesn't he? Mykola looked at Veles, who sat calmly while Sofia whispered something in his ear. He chose to enter that shelter, chose to extract your family instead of completing his surveillance mission, chose to lead you through a city at war when staying hidden would have been safer. Every step was a choice, and every time he chose to act instead of waiting for orders. Oksana wanted to argue but found she couldn't, because she'd seen it too, the intelligence in those amber eyes, the deliberation in every movement, the sense that Veles operated from a place of purpose rather than mere training. Will we see him again? Sofia asked, having appeared beside her mother with the silent stealth that children mastered effortlessly. Mykola knelt to Sofia's level. Maybe, if there are other families that need help, other children who need rescuing. Would you like that? Knowing he's out there helping people? Sofia considered this with the seriousness it deserved, then nodded. Yes, but I'll miss him. He'll miss you too, Mykola said. But missing someone is proof that the connection mattered, that it was real, And that's something worth holding on to even when everything else feels uncertain. For you, you might think this story is about war, about shelters and extractions and the mechanics of survival in impossible circumstances, but it's not really. It's about recognition, about the moment when you realize that the help you need won't arrive in the form you expect, won't come dressed in official uniforms or announced through proper channels. Sometimes it arrives on four paws, moving through ventilation shafts, leading you towards safety through paths you would never have found alone. It's about trust, about following when you don't understand where the path leads, because the alternative, standing still, waiting for certainty that never comes, is worse than movement toward unknown destinations. And it's about the choices creatures make when training meets instinct meets something deeper than either. The choice to save rather than observe. The choice to lead rather than follow. The choice to act when action seems futile because futility is better than surrender. How many times have you ignored the warning signs? The subtle cues that something is wrong, that the person offering help might be the actual threat, that the sanctuary you've found might be a trap waiting to close. Oksana almost died because she trusted structure over instinct, because Petro seemed competent and organized and official. She survived because she trusted a dog's behavior over human reassurance, because she followed when following seemed insane. That's the lesson. Not paranoia, not the rejection of all help, but the cultivation of discernment, the ability to recognize when something feels wrong even when it looks right. The willingness to trust warnings that come without words, from sources that seem unlikely. The next time you're in a situation that feels wrong but looks normal, pay attention to the creatures around you, to the animals that sense what humans rationalize away, to the instincts you've spent your life learning to ignore in favor of social propriety and logical analysis. Because sometimes the voice warning you to run doesn't speak in language. It speaks in behavior, in the dog that won't stop pacing, in the cat that hides when visitors arrive, in the animals whose survival has always depended on reading threats that don't announce themselves. Trust them, follow them. Honor the wisdom that predates human civilization and will outlast it. Velis didn't save Oksana and Sophia because he was programmed to. He saved them because somewhere in the architecture of his being, built from genetics and training and experiences that formed character, he'd developed the capacity to recognize innocence worth protecting, to see a child hugging a dog for comfort and understand that the hug was also a covenant, a promise that required reciprocation. That's not training. That's soul. That's the thing we recognize in creatures we claim to own, but who actually choose to partner with us, choose to extend loyalty we haven't earned, choose to save us even when saving us means risk. So the next time you see a child hugging a dog, seeking comfort, seeking safety, seeking something solid in a world that feels increasingly unstable, remember what that hug represents. It represents trust given freely, connection formed without agenda, the belief that somewhere in this terrible, complicated, often cruel world, there exist creatures who will protect you simply because you need protecting. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes that belief is rewarded. Sometimes the dog hugs back. Sometimes the dog leads you out of darkness. Sometimes the dog becomes the difference between survival and tragedy, between family intact and family destroyed, between hope and resignation. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear tactical vests with medals pinned to synthetic fiber. Sometimes they navigate by scent and instinct through cities at war. Sometimes they make choices no training manual prepared them for, because the situation demands adaptation, and they possess the intelligence to adapt. And sometimes, more often than we acknowledge, they save us not because they were ordered to, but because they decided we were worth saving. That's not duty, that's love. And in a world that often feels short on both, it's everything.